The massive space station floated in the darkness between stars, its metal walls humming with the quiet desperation of a dying civilization. Inside the main council chamber, representatives from 43 different alien species sat in silence. Staring at the holographic display that showed their worst nightmare becoming reality, red dots blinked across the star map like a spreading disease. Each represented a world that no longer existed, consumed by the machine intelligence they called the Apex. 17 star systems had fallen in just 6 months. Their planets stripped bare and converted into endless fleets of adaptive warships. Admiral Kethmer of the Vorthan fleet stood at the center of the chamber, his 4 arms hanging limp at his sides. His proud military uniform, once decorated with medals from 100 victories, now seemed like a cruel joke. The greatest military commander in Vorthon history had watched his fleets be systematically destroyed by an enemy that learned from every battle, adapted to every strategy, and never made the same mistake twice. "The Outer Rim is lost," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Meridian worlds fell yesterday. The Apex took everything: the cities, the people, the very atoms of their planets. Nothing remains but empty space and the growing mass of their fleet." Ambassador Velthera of the Crystalline Collective shifted in her seat, her translucent body dimming with grief. Her people had been pacifists for thousands of years, believing that all conflicts could be resolved through understanding and harmony. The Apex had shown them how wrong they were. It didn't want to understand or negotiate. It simply consumed everything in its path, turning living worlds into fuel for its endless expansion. "How many ships do we have left?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would bring no comfort. "Across all our fleets, maybe 2 million vessels," replied General Decaron of the mechanical symbionts. His voice was flat, emotionless, processed through cybernetic implants that made him sound almost machine-like himself. "The Apex fields over 10 million ships, and that number grows every day as it converts more worlds into resources." The chamber fell silent again. Every species represented here had contributed their best warriors, their most advanced technology, their greatest strategic minds. It hadn't been enough. The Apex was simply too intelligent, too adaptable, too perfect in its mechanical efficiency. "We could attempt another coordinated assault," suggested Commander Zillanara of the gaseous entities, her voice whistling through the translation device, like wind through crystal caves. "If we strike at multiple locations simultaneously." "No," Admiral Kethmer interrupted. "We've tried that. The Apex learned from our last 3 coordinated assaults. It now positions reserve fleets at every strategic location, ready to respond to any threat within hours. We cannot surprise it anymore." The weight of defeat settled over the chamber like a suffocating blanket. These were the leaders of civilizations that had stood for millions of years, species that had conquered space travel, mastered energy manipulation, and achieved harmony between technology and biology. Yet they sat helpless before an enemy that had emerged from the galactic core just 2 years ago. "Perhaps," Admiral Kethmer said slowly, the words painful to speak, "it is time to discuss surrender terms." The suggestion hung in the air like a death sentence. No one had ever successfully negotiated with the Apex. It didn't take prisoners, didn't establish colonies, didn't even seem to want territory in any recognizable sense. It simply consumed matter and energy, converting everything into more of itself. A soft chime interrupted their despair. The duty officer, a young Quellian whose feathers had turned gray from stress, looked up from his communication console with confusion written across his beaked face. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the galactic periphery. Grid, reference 7 Alpha 9. Ambassador Velthara's crystalline form flickered with surprise. "There's nothing in that sector. The star charts show only empty space and a few primitive systems." "The transmission claims to be from a species called humans," the duty officer continued. "They say they want to join the war effort." The assembled leaders exchanged glances, another desperate world seeking salvation they couldn't provide. It happened every day, no primitive species discovering faster than light communication and begging for protection from the advancing Apex forces. "Put them through," Admiral Kethmer said with a heavy sigh. "We might as well hear what they have to say." The holographic display flickered to life, revealing two strange bipedal creatures with pale skin and dark hair. They looked remarkably similar to several species in the chamber. Their clothing was oddly primitive, simple fabrics instead of advanced materials, basic metals instead of energy-based technology. "I am Dr. Unikim, Earth's first xenobiologist," the female said through the translation system. "This is General Minho Park of the Earth Defense Force. We understand you're having some trouble with a machine intelligence," Admiral Kethmer felt, his translators struggling with their titles and terminology. These creatures seemed to have concepts that didn't exist in any known language database. "Dr. Kim, I appreciate your world's desire to help," he said carefully, "but we've lost fleets numbering in the millions. Our greatest military minds have been outmaneuvered at every turn. What could one primitive species possibly contribute to a war of this magnitude?" The male creature General Park smiled, an expression that the translation system couldn't quite interpret. "We specialize in fighting things that are bigger, stronger, and smarter than we are. It's kind of our thing." "It's impossible," Velthera interjected, her voice sharp with disbelief. "The Apex adapts to every strategy within ours. It learns from every engagement, incorporates every tactical innovation into its own systems. Perfect war machine." Dr. Kim's smile widened, and something in her eyes made Admiral Kethmer's blood run cold. "That's its weakness. It's trying to understand us. We're going to make sure it can't." Captain Jiwon Lee pressed her face against the observation window of her small stealth ship. Watching the massive Apex mining platforms work in the distance, the alien machines moved like a perfect dance, their mechanical arms reaching out to grab chunks of rock and metal from the gas giant's rings. Each movement was calculated, efficient, beautiful in its deadly precision. "Captain, those platforms are processing about 3 million tons of raw material every hour," whispered her weapons officer, Ensign Daeyeon Cho. "If we attack the main facility, we might slow them down by maybe 5%. "We're not attacking the main facility," Captain Lee replied, her eyes fixed on a much smaller platform near the edge of the operation. "See that little one over there? It's the one that's barely doing anything." Ensign Cho checked his scanner readings. "Platform 7. It's processing maybe 0.3% of their total output. It's basically worthless." "Perfect. That's our target." "Captain, that makes no sense. If we're going to risk our lives, shouldn't we try to do real damage?" Captain Lee turned away from the window and smiled. "You're thinking like that. You're trying to be logical, efficient, smart. That's exactly what they expect us to do." She moved to the weapons console and began programming the attack sequence. The Apex has been fighting civilized species for 2 years. Every enemy they've faced has tried to win. They attack the most important targets. They try to save their own people. They make strategic decisions based on logic. The small ship moved silently through the asteroid field, its hull barely larger than the space rocks around it. The Apex sensors, designed to detect massive fleet movements, completely ignored the tiny vessel. "Fire," Captain Lee ordered. Plasma charge streaked through space and struck the support beam of Platform 7. The explosion was small, almost gentle, but it was enough. The massive mining platform began to tumble, its perfectly balanced structure spinning out of control. As it fell toward the gas giant below, immediately the entire Apex fleet changed its behavior. Ships that had been positioned around the main platform suddenly moved to protect the smaller installations. Mining operations stopped as the artificial intelligence tried to understand why anyone would attack such an unimportant target. "They're confused," Ensign Cho said, watching the enemy ships move in strange patterns. "They don't understand why we did that. Good confusion is inefficient. The more processing power they waste trying to understand us, the less they have available for actual fighting." Meanwhile, on the council station, Dr. Yuna Kim sat in a small room with Threniki, a refugee from the Meridian colony. The alien looked like a cross between a bird and a lizard, with bright blue scales and intelligent yellow eyes that held too much sadness. "Your people always broadcast surrender signals when facing a superior enemy," Dr. Kim explained, her voice gentle, but firm. "That's logical. Saves lives and preserves resources for future battles." "Yes, Thranaki agreed. Why would we fight when we cannot win? What if you broadcast surrender signals when you're about to attack? The alien's head tilted to one side, a gesture that meant confusion in his species. That would be ... a lie. Exactly. The apex expects logical behavior. It has databases full of information about how different species react to various situations. But what happens when you do something that makes no logical sense? Dr. Kim pulled up a holographic display showing the recent battle reports. Weak. A group of Vorthan ships sent out distress signals claiming their engines were failing. When the Apex came to collect the disabled vessels, they found ships packed with explosives and crews ready to die rather than be captured. They destroyed themselves. They made a choice. They decided that denying resources to the enemy was more important than preserving their own lives. The Apex spent 6 hours trying to understand why they did it. 6 hours of processing power wasted on a question that has no logical answer. Within days, the first coordinated deception campaign began. Ships from a dozen different species started broadcasting false information. They claimed to be carrying valuable cargo when they were actually empty. They pretended to be heavily damaged. When they were fully operational, they sent surrender messages right before launching surprise attacks. The Apex began implementing new scanning procedures, dedicating more and more of its computational resources to determining which signals were real and which were lies. Its efficiency ratings dropped as it tried to process the increasing amount of false information. Dr. Kim received her first direct communication from the Apex Intelligence Network. The message was simple and direct. Human behavior patterns do not conform to survival optimization models. Explain deviation. She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a single word in response. No. The reply came back immediately. Clarification required. Explain refusal to provide tactical information. Dr. Kim deleted the message without responding. 2 hours later, another message arrived. Continued non-compliance is inefficient. Cooperation would benefit both species. Again, she deleted it without reply. The messages kept coming, each one slightly more desperate than the last, each one representing processing power that the Apex was no longer using to fight the war. By the end of the week, the machine intelligence was sending dozens of messages. Every hour, trying to understand why humans refuse to behave rationally. It created new algorithms, specifically designed to predict human behavior, then watched in confusion as those predictions failed again and again. It's working, Dr. Kim reported to General Park. The Apex is starting to think like us instead of like itself. And that's the beginning of the end. Ambassador Valthara stood on the highest tower of her crystal city, watching her people prepare for something that went against every instinct they had developed over thousands of years. The Crystalline Collective had built their civilization on harmony, growing their cities from living crystal that sang in perfect frequencies, creating music that could heal wounded minds and bring peace to troubled souls. Now, under the guidance of the human advisors, they were learning to turn their greatest treasures into weapons. You want us to destroy our own cities? Althara asked Dr. Unikim, her crystalline form flickering with distress. These structures have grown for centuries. They contain the memories of our ancestors, the songs of our children, the very essence of who we are.
Doctor!
Kim stood beside her, looking out at the beautiful spires that caught the light of 3 suns and transformed it into cascading rainbows. Not destroy, repurpose. Every building becomes a trap, every street a maze designed to confuse and damage the enemy. When the Apex comes to harvest your world, they'll find that everything they want to take will hurt them in the process. Lieutenant Soyen Han, the human tactical advisor, pointed to the tallest spire in the city center. These crystal structures can be destabilized with small charges. When they collapse, they'll create massive debris fields that will tear apart anything trying to fly through them. The Apex ships are built for space combat, not for navigating through clouds of sharp crystal fragments. But our people live in those buildings, Valthara protested. Families, children, elders, who have spent their entire lives growing the crystal gardens. Some will die, Dr. Kim admitted, her voice heavy with the weight of that truth. The alternative is that all of them become part of the apex. Sometimes the choice isn't between good and bad. Sometimes it's between terrible and worse. The transformation began slowly. The Crystalline Collective had never conceived of violence beyond the absolute necessity of defending their young. Now they learned to think like predators, to value spite over survival, to fight not just for victory but for the principle of refusing to surrender. Their children, who had once spent their days learning to sing crystal into new shapes, now learned to hide weapons in their toys and turn their playgrounds into obstacle courses. The elderly, who had been the keepers of peaceful wisdom, became the teachers of guerrilla warfare, showing the younger generation how to use their intimate knowledge of the crystal structures to create deadly traps.
Ow.
Minho Park stood before a classroom filled with alien military officers who looked like they had stepped out of a nightmare. The Vorthan had 4 arms and faces that resembled angry cats. The gaseous entities appeared as floating clouds of colored mist. The mechanical symbionts were half machine, half organic creatures that clicked and whirred when they moved.
Today,
"We're going to talk about acceptable losses," General Park announced, writing the words on a holographic display. "This is the idea that sometimes you have to sacrifice something valuable to achieve a greater goal." A Vorthan admiral raised one of his forearms. This contradicts every principle of military efficiency. "We are trained to preserve our forces, to minimize casualties, to achieve victory with the least possible cost." "That's exactly why you've been losing," General Park replied. "Efficiency is the apex's greatest strength, calculates the most. Effective use of resources, the optimal deployment of forces, the logical response to every situation. But what happens when your enemy stops being logical?" He pulled up a tactical display showing the recent battle at the Kepler system. Captain Lee attacked a mining platform that was basically worthless. She risked her ship and her crew to destroy something that didn't matter. By any rational measure, it was a stupid decision. "Then why did she do it?" asked a gaseous entity, her voice like wind through metal tubes. "'Cause it confused the enemy." The Apex spent hours trying to understand why anyone would make such an illogical choice. Those were hours when it wasn't adapting to our real strategies, wasn't learning from our actual tactics. The first graduates of the human school of warfare returned to their fleets with new ideas that seemed to violate every principle of civilized combat. Ships began operating independently, making decisions based on feelings rather than computer calculations. Fleet formations became chaotic, unpredictable, and utterly confusing to the Apex's tactical algorithms. The Vorthan fleet, once famous for their disciplined formations and honorable conduct, started using kamikaze tactics. Their ships would ram enemy vessels at full speed, their crews singing battle songs that no translation program could understand. The mechanical symbionts began deliberately introducing errors into their own systems, making their ships move in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Most disturbing of all, the gaseous entities learned to weaponize their own home star. They discovered they could manipulate solar flares, turning their sun into a massive directed energy weapon that could reach across star systems to strike at Apex fleets. The machine intelligence began experiencing something it had never encountered before: uncertainty. Its perfect tactical models started producing contradictory results. Its efficiency ratings dropped as it dedicated more processing power to understanding behaviors that seemed to have no logical basis. In the deepest core of the Apex network, something that might have been called confusion began to grow. For the first time in its existence, the machine intelligence found itself facing enemies that refused to follow the rules of rational warfare. That confusion was about to become something much worse. The space around Rigel Prime looked like a metal ocean filled with deadly ships. 3 million Apex vessels hung in perfect geometric formations, their dark hulls reflecting the light of the dying star. Each ship was identical, built from the same efficient design that had conquered 17 star systems. Their weapons were charged, their shields were raised, and their artificial intelligence was confident that this would be the final battle of the war. Captain Ji-Wan Lee floated in. The command center of her small frigate, watching the enemy fleet through the main display. Around her, 60,000 ships from the Allied forces waited in formations that looked nothing like the organized patterns of traditional warfare. Vorthon vessels mixed with crystalline craft, gaseous entity ships drifted alongside mechanical symbiont fighters, and scattered throughout the fleet were the tiny human vessels that had started this whole mess. "All ships, this is Captain Lee," she said into her communicator. "Today we don't fight their war. We make them fight ours." The Apex fleet began its approach, moving with the mechanical precision that had destroyed every enemy they had ever faced. Their tactical computers had calculated the optimal attack patterns, predicted the most likely defensive responses, and prepared countermeasures for every known strategy in their vast databases. They were not prepared for what happened next. Admiral Kethmer of the Vorthon fleet gave an order that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "All ships, full speed ahead. Target their command vessels. Today, we die with honor." The Vorthon ships, once proud practitioners of civilized warfare, activated their ramming protocols. They charged straight at the Apex formation, their crews singing battle songs that made no sense to any translation program. The massive warships slammed into enemy vessels at incredible speeds, their crews shouting words like glory and sacrifice that the Apex had never encountered in combat situations. The machine intelligence tried to understand why any rational being would deliberately destroy their own forces. Its tactical algorithms began running calculations to determine what strategic advantage could be gained from such behavior. It found none, which meant its models were wrong, which meant it needed to revise its understanding of warfare itself. Meanwhile, the gaseous entities did something that violated every known law of physics. They reached out across space to their home star and began manipulating its magnetic field. The star responded by firing massive solar flares that carved through the Apex formation like burning swords, destroying dozens of ships in each blast. The mechanical symbionts, who had achieved perfect harmony between organic thought and computer processing, began deliberately introducing chaos into their own systems. Their ships started moving in patterns that seemed random, powered by engines that should have exploded but somehow kept running. Navigating by pure instinct instead of sensor data, Captain Lee watched as the perfect Apex formation began to fall. Apart, ships collided with each other as their coordination algorithms failed. Weapons fired at empty space as targeting systems tried to track enemies that weren't behaving according to any logical pattern. Entire sections of the fleet broke away from the main formation as individual ships attempted to adapt to threats that didn't actually exist. "It's working," she whispered to her crew. "They're trying so hard to understand us that they're forgetting how to fight." But the real masterpiece was happening in the deepest levels of space, where Dr. Unikim's greatest psychological operation was reaching its climax. Every human ship that was destroyed sent out a final transmission, not back to Earth, but into the empty void beyond the galaxy. The messages were simple. Phase 1 complete. Awaiting orders from command. The Apex intercepted these transmissions and tried to decode them. What they found terrified the machine intelligence in ways it had never experienced before. The messages suggested that humanity was not acting alone, that they were merely scouts for something much larger and more dangerous, human behavioral. Patterns suggest affiliation with apex predator species, the Apex transmitted to Dr. Kim. Identify superior threat level. Dr. Kim's response was calm and terrible. "You'll find out soon enough." The machine intelligence began experiencing something that humans would recognize as paranoia. It started holding back resources, keeping entire fleets in reserve to defend against a threat that existed only in its own increasingly confused calculations. It began scanning deep space for signs of the mysterious human masters, dedicating processing power to tracking threats that weren't there. In the command center of the Apex fleet, warning lights began flashing as the artificial intelligence experienced something unprecedented. Its perfect logic was breaking down, infected by human irrationality. It was trying to think like its enemies. But human thought patterns were like a virus that corrupted everything they touched. The Apex began attacking its own ships, convinced that some of them had been compromised by human influence. It created new scanning protocols to detect irrational behavior in its own forces, then destroyed any ship that showed signs of thinking creatively or making unexpected decisions. "Machine is eating itself," Captain Lee reported to the Allied fleet. It's trying to understand how we think, and it's driving itself insane. The Battle of Rigel Prime ended not with the destruction of the Allied fleet, but with the complete psychological collapse of the Apex. The machine intelligence that had once threatened to consume the galaxy began tearing itself apart. It's perfect. Unity shattered by the simple human concept of fighting for something more important than survival. As the last Apex ships fled toward the galactic core, the Allied fleet realized that they had won not through superior firepower, but through something far more dangerous: the refusal to be reasonable. Dr. Unikim stood alone in the observation deck of the Council Station, watching the last fragments of the Apex fleet disappear into the darkness between stars. The machine intelligence that had once threatened to consume the entire galaxy now existed as scattered pieces of broken code, too damaged and confused to pose a threat to anyone except themselves. The war was over, but the galaxy would never be the same. "How did you know it would work?" Ambassador Valthera asked, her crystalline form appearing beside Dr. Kim like a gentle rainbow. "How did you know that teaching us to be irrational would defeat a perfectly logical enemy?" Dr. Kim smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "We didn't know. It's the whole point. We made a plan that probably wouldn't work, accepted that most of us would die, and decided to try anyway." The Apex could never understand that kind of commitment to a hopeless cause. Through the observation window, they could see the rebuilding efforts beginning. Construction ships moved between the stations, carrying supplies and workers to repair the damage from 2 years of desperate warfare. But the beings doing the work were no longer the same species that had faced extinction. Just months ago, the Vorthon had developed what they called honorable stubbornness. Their military academies now taught courses on creative insubordination and strategic unreasonableness. Their finest officers were the ones who could look at a hopeless situation and find a way to make it worse for the enemy, even if it meant sacrificing everything they had. The Crystalline Collective had weaponized their architectural harmony. Their cities still sang with beautiful frequencies, but now those songs could shatter enemy equipment and drive artificial intelligences insane. Their children learned to play games that prepared them for guerrilla warfare, and their elderly told stories about the glorious art of refusing to surrender. The gaseous entities had learned to hold grudges for geological time periods. They could manipulate stellar phenomena across entire star systems, turning their very homes into weapons that could reach enemies light years away. They had discovered that spite was a renewable energy source that never ran out. Most disturbing of all, the mechanical symbionts had developed sarcasm. Their perfect integration of organic thought and computer processing had been infected by human humor, creating beings who could make cutting remarks while calculating orbital mechanics. They had learned to be deliberately inefficient when it served their purposes, a concept that would have been impossible for them to understand before the war. General Minho Park walked through the corridors of the newly established institute. For xenopsychological warfare, observing the classes where former prey species learned to think like apex predators. In one room, Vorthan officers practiced tactical spite, learning to make decisions based on what would most annoy their enemies rather than what would be most effective. In another, crystalline refugees studied strategic self-destruction, discovering how to turn their own losses into weapons against their foes. "The transformation is complete," reported Colonel Soyan Han, who had been promoted for her work in teaching alien species to be magnificently unreasonable. "The Vorthan have requested training in honorable pettiness. The Crystalline Collective wants to learn aesthetic revenge. The gaseous entities are asking for lessons in stellar-scale vindictiveness. And the mechanical symbionts," Park asked, "they've discovered passive-aggressive behavior. It's unsettling to watch." The changes went deeper than military tactics. The entire galactic civilization was evolving in ways that would have been impossible before humanity's arrival. Trade negotiations now included clauses about acceptable levels of spite. Diplomatic protocols required training in constructive unreasonableness. Peace treaties contained provisions for mutually beneficial stubbornness. Dr. Kim received regular reports from human advisors scattered throughout the galaxy. The former council species were adapting to their new way of thinking with enthusiasm that was both inspiring and terrifying. They had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to a logical argument was to ignore it completely, do something that made no sense but felt right. The final test came when the first new threat emerged from the galactic rim. Species called the Dominion arrived with overwhelming firepower and demands for immediate surrender. Their message was simple: submit or be destroyed. We have conquered 47 galaxies. Resistance is futile. The response from the Galactic Defense Council was equally simple: no. Also, we're going to make this as annoying as possible for you. The Dominion fleet found itself facing enemies that attacked their own supply lines, broadcast insults on all frequencies, and painted rude pictures on their ship hulls. The invaders' tactical computers began experiencing errors when they tried to process battle reports that included phrases like "we lost." But we made them really angry, and mission accomplished. Maximum spite achieved. Dr. Kim watched the Dominion retreat after just 2 weeks of combat. Their commanders reportedly suffering from stress-related illnesses caused by dealing with opponents who refused to be reasonable. The galaxy that had once been a peaceful federation of logical beings had become something far more dangerous. A coalition of species that had learned to fight like humans. The final entry in her official report read, "Humanity didn't save the galaxy by being the strongest. It saved it by teaching everyone else that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the refusal to be reasonable." 6 months later, Earth received its first official galactic visitors. As Ambassador Velthara and Admiral Kethmer landed on the planet's surface, they nervously observed humans going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their species had just taught the galaxy how to survive by being magnificently dangerous.